Welcome to Economy Disrupted. I'm Stephanie Siegel, Senior Fellow with the Economics Program at CSIS. This week, we're going to be talking about US-China relations against the backdrop of a pandemic, a global recession, and political uncertainty with US elections now just 5 months away. As you're watching, please submit your questions to csis.org, Economy Disrupted.
And I'm Matthew Goodman, Senior Vice President for Economics at CSIS. Welcome to episode 2 of Economy Disrupted. We're delighted to have you with us. We're going to wrap up around 1:50 today with an item we call the bottom line, so I hope you'll stick around through that. But for now, I'm delighted to introduce our guest this week, former U.S. Trade Representative Ambassador Charlene Barshefsky, now partner at Wilmer Hale, a prominent law firm here in Washington. Delighted to have you with us, Charlene.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. So every week in Washington seems to be an eventful week these days, but this one has been particularly eventful on China-related matters, which is the subject of our conversation today. You had a combination of U.S. Trade Representative Lighthizer testimony, which dwelled a lot on China. You had Secretary of State Pompeo visiting his counterpart Yang Jiechi in Hawaii. You had the president signing the Uyghur sanctions bill. You had the Bolton revelations as well that touched on China, of course. I don't expect you to get into any of those specific issues, but I wonder what they say to you about the state of U.S.-China relations generally. And, to me, I sort of see a common theme in all those things that I mentioned. There are very strong personalities involved, and it seems that in international relations, personalities do play an important role in the policy choices that they make. And so what I'm wondering is, against the backdrop of this sort of view that there are broader forces at play, that there's a sort of Thucydides trap that the U.S. and China are caught in, and that we're inevitably going to clash because we're an established player and a rising power that are in conflict. Those are sort of different views of the world, and I just wonder where you come out on, how inevitable it is that we're in this position, or how much is it a function of people's choices and the personalities involved on both sides. Go ahead. I think you're on.
What you've mentioned, you can see the U.S. essentially buffeted around by individual pronouncements by various members of the administration, most of which are inconsistent with each other, buffeted around by statements by President Trump, often inconsistent with all the other inconsistencies, buffeted around by statements coming out of China, buffeted around by the notion of a Thucydides trap or other construct into which some believe we must fall or may fall. What that tells me is that the U.S. has no policy with respect to China. It may have personal predilection. There may be individual pronouncements made by people in the administration, but that's not a policy. There is no anchor to the way in which the U.S. views itself in the world, or views the world. Instead, what we see is an administration focused on China. The focus shouldn't be on China per se, right? You start with the United States. What are our goals? What are our aspirations as a country? Where do we think we fit in the world? What do we hope to see for the world that our children will inherit? Now, where does China fit in that? Where does Europe fit in that? Where does Russia fit in that? If pieces fit in a manner consistent with our vision for ourselves as a country, great. If they don't fit well, or if indeed they're destructive to that vision and that aspiration, then you take countermeasures. You decide what it is you need to do to ensure that your goals can be met. None of that strategic thinking is going on. And the result is people are focused on the day-to-day, the ups and downs, how many soybeans last week were purchased versus this week, instead of keeping your eye on the ball. And this is, of course, where the China system is much more effective. There are specific goals, specific timeframes, specific metrics. Things may not work out as you hope, but the value in planning, the value in having a strategic point of view is critical. That's what the United States lacks. And it's why all of these individuals and individual pronouncements and contradictions and confusion is the fare of the day.
Well said. Speaking of strategy, 20 years ago, the U.S. had a strategy of pulling China into the World Trade Organization and the broader global rules-based system. And there are people today who say that was a mistake and it's led to all these problems today. I don't agree with that. I think that's a revisionist view that doesn't reflect kind of what was going on at the time and what actually happened in that agreement. You were the chief negotiator with your counterpart, Zhu Rongji, in China back then in the late 90s. And I just wonder, generally how you respond to that, but also maybe specifically just to challenge you a bit. Is there one specific thing we might have done then if we sort of knew, and I'm asking in hindsight, I'm not asking when you were there, but in hindsight, now that you're looking back, that one thing we could have done then that would have helped now?
Well, the one thing is enforcement, which I'll come back to. We were, I think, inexcusably lax as a country through many administrations in enforcement of the WTO deal. But I would say this. At the time, so we're talking now the 1990s, the US had spent 20 plus years encouraging China to open up, to reform economically, to become more user-friendly, if you will, for Western nations. As China embarked under Deng Xiaoping a system of internal economic reform, it was important to take those steps and begin to mold them, or try and mold them, in a manner more consistent with Western interests, and not coincidentally, in a manner better for China as well. So as the years went by, and as China's reform became more robust, the US and we in the Clinton administration attempted to capture that, to expand it, to deepen, to broaden it, and to make it a series of policies and changes in the trade regime that over time would be more compatible with Western economic norms. No one, myself included, expected China to become a capitalist, pure capitalist country. But if you could achieve greater consistency, that achieves a lot. It reduces friction. It creates the beginning of a level playing field. The difficulty, and that is absolutely what happened until you hit about 2006, 2007. And at that point, China began to diverge from this movement toward Western economic norms. And China set out on a different path, turbocharged by Xi Jinping. But this is now 20 years later, 20 years after the fact. So pre-WTO, China already had full access into every economy in the world. The issue of WTO accession is getting into the China market. And today, of course, China is the world's second biggest importer, right behind the United States. So that goal was achieved. China's market is infinitely more open today than it was. Is it still problematic? Highly. Chinese reform and opening began to sputter around 2007, and under Xi Jinping, it stopped. So that further reform, further opening, further leveling the playing field never happened, and instead China began to regress. How might that have been stopped? If there had been better use of the tools in the WTO agreement specific tools for the China situation, I think we would have been in a far situation. But neither the George W. Bush administration or the Obama administration, or frankly the Trump administration, used the tools available to it. And instead, of course, as you know, the US has embarked on this tariff war. So I do think better enforcement could have made a substantial difference. I'd say one last thing, if I could, Matt, and that is really in line with your first question. You think about leaders and leadership and the effect of leaders on a country. So imagine for a moment if Xi Jinping were not the president of China. Imagine for a moment if Donald Trump were not the president of the United States. And imagine instead two very different personalities, two very different, two different views of the economy, very different views about the value of cooperation, different views about how best to confront. I think we'd be in a different situation than we are today.
Important point about having that imagination and keeping that always, because things are not always the same depending on the circumstances and the players. Stephanie?
Thanks. And thanks, Charlene, for being with us today. I want to stick with the trade theme for a little while longer and talk more specifically about the phase one trade deal. So we had testimony yesterday from USTR Lighthizer, essentially saying that things are still moving along. But that deal, phase one deal, has come under criticism in two distinct respects. First, on the process side, what we got with the phase one deal was basically a negotiated trade outcome. And that outcome was a commitment for a certain amount of large purchases. And that seems to go against kind of the market-based model that the US has largely championed in globalization efforts. So it's been criticized for the process of a managed trade outcome. And then it's also been criticized because the outcome itself actually makes US exporters more dependent on the Chinese market. And so at this time of heightened tensions between the US and China, the wisdom of increasing that dependency has been questioned. So I'd love to hear your views on both of those things, the managed trade outcome and then increased dependency that results from the agreements.
So a word about the phase one deal, which is in addition to the managed outcomes with respect to purchases, of course, there's some other aspects of the agreement that I think are a little bit glanced over, which bear mentioning. I don't think they're spectacular or fantabulous, but I do think they're helpful. One is, of course, a further elucidation of tech transfer rules. Of course, the WTO accession that we did in '99 prohibited forced technology transfer. This is one of the areas that no administration has enforced based on that obligation. But this phase one agreement builds on that obligation. I think that's helpful. And of course, there were some changes as well with respect to intellectual property and the creation of an action plan. Again, these are not earth-shattering. China has many years before done action plans on intellectual property. But nonetheless, they are, I think, additions to the purchases. With respect to the purchases, you have a very strange situation. That is, the United States criticizes China for being a statist, state-controlled economic system. We've criticized the power of state enterprises with respect to the purchase and sale of goods, favoritism bestowed on state enterprises. Well, who's making all these purchases? It isn't the mom and pop shops, it's the state enterprises in China. So when we demanded these purchases be made, what we're saying to China is, use your state enterprises, dictate to them what they have to buy, make sure they buy it. This is exactly what the US has fought against, not just with respect to China, but with respect to Europe and many other countries for the last 40 years. So we are enhancing the power of state enterprises. We are tacitly approving of the power of the state to, for political reasons, direct that certain transactions take place. And, as you noted, we're making the US agricultural community more dependent on sales to China, not less dependent on sales to China. So there is a kind of concentration risk there that likely that could become a danger later on. So this is a very strange set of outcomes. Last point to make is, of course, the reason for wanting these managed numbers, apart from politics, is this notion, which is demonstrably false, that we will erase the trade deficit with China if they buy more of our agriculture. And of course, trade deficits, which are enormous in size and tend to speak to the strength of your economy relative to the other economy in which you are in deficit. I know it's intuitive, but it is the case, is not going to be erased by these managed purchases. Trade flows and the complexity of global trade is such that micro decisions will not affect the macroeconomic outcomes, nor do they affect the outcome on the trade deficit when the reasons for the deficit have virtually nothing to do with trade and everything to do with capital flows, levels of investment, and of course the role of the dollar as the world's reserve currency.
Yeah, and actually you bring up the thing that I wanted to ask you about next, which is the fact that what was really kind of the dominant narrative for the first couple years of the Trump administration behind these US-China tensions was trade balances, trade in goods and services. But over the past year, I think we've seen some of those tensions migrate from the trading side to the investment side. So we've seen in the United States a reform to our mechanism for screening foreign investment that was largely motivated by concerns about Chinese investment coming into the United States. We've also seen and actually encouraged a number of our allies to also tighten up their foreign investment screening regimes. And then just in recent weeks, there is a lot of activity around the potential for delisting Chinese companies in the US and potentially preventing US investors from investing in Chinese securities. So this tension has migrated, it seems, to the investment side of the ledger. I'm wondering if you could speak. I mean, you obviously have a career in public service, but you also have been on corporate boards, including companies that have investments in China. And the role of these investment flows. Some people would say that those investment linkages actually serve as a buffer. They align interests and have common interests, so they're a buffer in the relationship, and that's a good thing. Others say, no, it's the exact same problem, that you've created dependency, and that dependency undermines our national security and our economic security. So where do you come out on that issue? And if these investment flows are a positive that can help support the relationship or actually undermine our security?
So I think it depends what investment flows you're looking at. So in the case of technology, and for example, the Chinese acquisition spree with respect to sensitive or near sensitive technologies, one could argue that as a matter of national security, those investments should be carefully screened, should be looked at with a critical eye, and determinations need to be made whether investments of that sort might threaten to impair US national security. And if so, to perhaps disallow those investments or impose mitigating features on those investments, so on and so forth. But with respect to your ordinary investment flows, which of course, by the way, keep the United States alive, right? the position we would be in without that inward flow would be as Argentina is today. So with respect to the normal investment flows, let's think about China. It's a fifth of the world's population, 1/5. 1/5 of the world's consumers live in China. 1/5 of the market of the world is in China. How do you walk away from a fifth of the market globally? Of course you want to access that market. Of course you want to be able to serve consumers in that market. And of course, as we do in Europe, and Europe does here, Canada the same, you want to use that market also as a further export base. These are all positive attributes of investment. It allows you as a company to enhance your presence globally, to reach consumers you might not otherwise reach, to participate in markets that are often benefited by inward investment, not only for job creation and the alleviation of poverty, but also foreign companies tend to bring with them and with their investment better practices than existed in the markets, including with respect to labor relations and with respect to the environment. It's not perfect, that's for sure, but it's often better than what existed. And to the extent it helps raise the level of security in that country with respect to its population, that's a good thing. So I think this notion that all investment is bad or all investment is a threat to the United States is absolutely wrong. For those investments that are sensitive for security reasons, that I put in a different category. But with respect to the ordinary flow of capital and investment into countries, including, fortunately, our own country, we see, I think, many, many positive attributes to investment. One last point, and that is concentration risk. We were just talking about concentration risk in agriculture in the United States. How do you best diversify concentration risk? How do you mitigate concentration risk? You don't sell just into one market and hope that market stays healthy for the duration. You spread your sales, you spread your manufacturing, and you avail yourself not only of potential cost or other logistical, other advantages, but also the advantage of not being overly concentrated or overly dependent on a particular market. That's another important function of investment.
Yeah, and you're alluding to something that I hope we have time to come back to, and that is the fact that we're not really in a closed system of just two countries. It's actually taking place against a global backdrop, and that's something hopefully we can come back to shortly.
Let's try to do that if we have time. Let me just shift gears, though, if I could, Charlene, and ask you about China's industrial policies and their sort of massive subsidies, and that's obviously right at the heart of the economic tension between the U.S. and China right now. Last week, the Wall Street Journal reported that Chinese local jurisdictions, egged on by Beijing, are going to be spending a collective $1 trillion, that's trillion with a T, dollars on investments in artificial intelligence, in data centers, and mobile communications, and so forth. They're calling this the new infrastructure policy, which sounds very benign, but it sort of echoes the old Made in China 2025 plan that supposedly has been set aside. Meanwhile, last week, a bipartisan group of senators and members of the House of Representatives here tabled a bill proposing a $25 billion with a B dollar investment in semiconductor production, funding and tax credits to promote domestic semiconductor production, which sort of sounds like an industrial policy as well, and albeit on a much smaller 1/40th, I guess, the scale of China. So one other data point, which is that if you look at national R&D spending as a sort of broader investment in innovation in both countries, China is ramping up its spending, whereas in the U.S., federally funded R&D has dropped from close to 2% of GDP during the space race in the 1960s down to, I think, a 60-year low of about 0.6% of GDP. So against that backdrop, how worried are you about all of this? And what should the U.S. be doing? Should we be trying to emulate China and doing more industrial policy or more an innovation policy, if you want to use a more polite term, perhaps?
So the U.S. ought to do what it used to be great at and no longer is. And that is that during the space race and pre-space race and then immediately post, you had extraordinary cooperation between the federal government, federal funding of universities in the United States, particularly research-oriented universities in the United States, and the private sector. And that triangle, government funding of really smart people and private sector ingenuity, created most of the technologies we're still riding on now, right? Our R&D funding is disgraceful. Basic funding for R&D should be a top priority of the United States. It has not been since the space race. The focus on expenditures that are unrelated to progress in that way, in the sciences and other areas, is a terrible mistake. The United States has no innovation policy, no innovation plan. We've had countless commissions that have looked at the question of U.S. competitiveness more broadly and U.S. innovation policy. And despite report after report after report over many, many years, we don't seem to implement even the most basic budgetary changes, for example, increases in the federal basic R&D funding budget. So this, I think China does us a favor in the sense that it puts a spotlight on the inadequacies of the U.S. system, not to adopt industrial policy ultimately for the U.S. It's not our system. I don't think our government is good at it anyway. But to be sure that there is ample funding to go to the uses that would be most productive in terms of innovation development. And to me, that includes most especially our research universities, as well as government, private sector, university cooperation.
Excellent. This is something we've been looking at pretty hard at CSIS, and as you know, in the Trade Commission, which you co-chair, by the way, we have a sort of focused look at that question of what we should be doing and investing in innovation to be competitive. This is not with reference to China, it's sort of what should we do for ourselves. We'll be coming back to you on that question soon. Over to you, Stephanie.
Sure. Well, and actually, one of the reasons that we've been looking at that issue, we've started talking about kind of what are the domestic foundations for U.S. leadership. And we've been asking ourselves that question in part because even going back to the last election cycle, you could see that support for globalization, support for U.S. leading in the world was not anything that really either candidate was running on, right? There was kind of this anti-globalization sentiment in both parties, frankly. When we launched this series a couple of weeks ago, we had Larry Summers was our first guest. He gave an interview recently where he was critical of the way that past administrations, going back a ways, have pursued globalization, basically saying that we have done so in a way that has benefited corporate interests, but not necessarily benefited American workers and consumers. And so that's a critique. I'm curious, obviously, as a former USTR yourself, I'm curious how that sounds to you, that criticism, if there's something to it, and if so, what to do about it. So the issue of globalization
has always been front and center, rather than the issue of domestic policymaking. So globalization, we know, has enhanced aggregate global GDP. The more nations trade with each other, the wealthier they become in aggregate. If you take it to an individual country level, that in aggregate has a stronger GDP because of trade, what happens to the gains? Who gets the gains? Is that a function of globalization or of domestic policy? Who benefits from the tax cuts that are enacted? What happens when you don't fund the schools? What happens when there is no health care? The gains from globalization are not shared the way they should be shared in the United States. They haven't been. That has to change. But that is a function of US domestic policy. Now, globalization certainly intensifies competition. And there are industries in the United States that are more import sensitive than others. But there are discrete and I think powerful ways of dealing with that form of dislocation, as you see in countries like Germany or Korea or elsewhere, that have extremely effective programs for workers who lose their job for no fault of their own, which the US doesn't adopt, has never adopted, again, because the aggregate gain in GDP is not distributed in the way in which it should be distributed. So the American people, when you look at polling data, recent polling data even, are rather more internationalist than political campaigns would lead you to believe. They know, by and large, we live in a globalized world. They want the US to succeed. They don't like unfair trade practices, and they shouldn't. They're absolutely right. But the notion that we can walk away and be successful as a nation is equally untenable to the majority of American people. But this issue of the distributional benefits of trade, the distributional benefits of globalization, is one that is crying out for rational, people-oriented distribution, not what we have today.
And I'm so glad actually that you kind of link that to the distributional effects, and also you mentioned unemployment, what you do when workers are displaced from globalization. And in a future episode, going to be looking at this issue and at the issue of inequality, in particular, when we're talking about the impacts of COVID-19. Some of the longer term trends that we've observed just with job losses, we're now going to be facing on a very accelerated timeline, because COVID-19 has been a shock that's really accelerated some of these changes. So that's something we're going to get back to in future episodes. But I'm really glad that you made that linkage between the globalization and kind of what's happening with the distributional effects here at home. Matt.
So we want to bring some of the audience in, but let me just try to squeeze in one more question at a, again, different level, which is the talk about decoupling of the U.S. and Chinese economies, and the sort of parallel talk about competition in the world for who's going to write the rules and norms and set the rules and norms of the global economy. And some see the world sort of splitting into two blocks, a U.S.-China block. There might be a third or fourth block. You might have an EU-centered block because they don't agree with everything that we want in the rules of the norms. And then there's the rest of the world, which maybe has to figure out which of these blocks it wants to associate with itself with. So there's going to be a competition over those parts of the world. Is this the world you see, this sort of bifurcated or trifurcated world? And what are the kind of costs and possible advantages of that world compared to other possible futures? And is there anything we can do about it for that matter? What would make it more or less likely to emerge, that kind of world?
Well, certainly the more the U.S. moves away from a leadership position globally by its own doing, the more inept we appear, as for example during COVID, the more chaotic our international environment. Chaos is not our friend in the international environment. We have benefited from 70 years of U.S. leadership, our alliance structure, our humanitarian assistance, and so on, that has made the global environment reasonably conducive to American interests, not always, but reasonably conducive to American interests, and has left us in a position where we are, in an odd kind of way, very familiar with the world. And the world is very familiar with us. And there's a comfort in that kind of stability and knowledge. Now what you have is something very different. If you think of the US and China, there is more than just the fear of economic decoupling. There's something else going on entirely, which is the notion of competing models of governance, models and modes of behavior that for the US as a rule of law, democracy based country, notions of individual freedom with Western allies on the one side, and China very explicitly offering up what they call the alternative, or the China model, which is largely building a world very conducive to China's interests. Countries sign up for laissez-faire positive economics in exchange for deference to China or non-opposition to Chinese positions. This is really the essence of Belt and Road, ultimately, if you think of Belt and Road geopolitically, not economically. So we see a different kind of challenge faced by the US and Western democracies, an alternative model that at least superficially looks successful, as opposed to the old Soviet model, which never looked successful, which looks successful. And so apart from the economic side and this notion of model, of what the world should look like in the main, the United States, and this is why I started in the beginning with this, has to decide where it sits and what it believes in and what it believes the world should look like. And then go about rekindling that coalition so that at a minimum you have competition, but it's reasonably even, no one interfering too much with the other because the stakes become too high, the disruption becomes too great for everybody, and you live in a kind of duopoly, duopolistic world, if you will. Is that sustainable? Is it viable? I don't know, but it's where we're headed. There's a view that the middle powers will come to the fore. Middle powers, Japan, Korea, for example, maybe a Brazil, maybe a South Africa, that middle powers will come to the fore. I'm less optimistic about that because countries aren't really self-organizing. And in that group, it's not clear to me there is an organizing force, not one that's sustainably acceptable to the other members of the middle powers, or that's trusted by the other members of the middle powers. So we, in any form in which we're looking at a more chaotic world, I think I can say reasonably unequivocally, we are less well off than we are under a system of rules and norms and a heavy dose of US leadership.
Well said. Stephanie, do you want to do questions?
Sure. I know we've got a number of questions that have come in now from the audience. One that I'm hoping I can link to the last question I wanted to ask you about. One of them here is, how might US-China relations change with a Biden leadership? And then if I can build on that, what about the role of the US relationship with other countries and how that impacts the dynamic between US and China? What might that look like under a Biden presidency?
So not speaking for the Biden campaign, but I think most people who have followed policy feel they have a pretty strong sense of where Joe Biden is. He's a basic internationalist, believes in the alliance structure, very much so, in the alliance structure, and the fact that it is the way in which the U.S. not only projects power, but also creates greater stability for itself and its partners. I believe he has always stood for the proposition that the U.S. has responsibilities abroad. And those responsibilities, in turn, help the United States, help our allies, help to create a more peaceful external environment, not only for us, but for others. On the other hand, and let me add, and of course, during the Obama administration, he was the point person with Xi Jinping. Before Xi Jinping became president, Joe Biden had spent very considerable time with him. Now, the other side. The atmosphere in the United States is very negative with respect to China, generally positive with respect to our allies, but very negative with respect to China. And so the political milieu is a very different one from the one that existed during Obama or during Joe Biden's very long Senate life. And in that context, of course, I think it's fair to say he's also always believed in reciprocal relations, notions of reciprocity, of fairness, of a level playing field. And I would expect that those elements would also be emphasized in a Biden administration. I think he'd be very tough on China because he doesn't like unfairness, doesn't like the feeling that the U.S. Is being denigrated, if you will. But I think the big difference is that because he believes in alliances, and because he believes in the value of cooperation, including with those with whom you're not aligned, but where cooperation is important nonetheless, he will develop a cooperative agenda with China. As, of course, we should. And I think that this will be one of the hallmarks for him.
So I had wanted to ask you about something you mentioned in passing, which was the Belt and Road Initiative. I didn't because we had a separate session on that, which I commend to viewers. It's on our website at CSIS. Charlene and her co-chair and colleague Steve Hadley did a great event a couple weeks ago on the Higher Road, this report that we did a year ago on global infrastructure strategy. So I will sort of avoid asking about it, but also give you the opportunity to explain why you're so worried about it, because it feels like China's not getting much love with Belt and Road, whether it's because countries feel the Chinese are just coming in and sort of stripping stuff out and not leaving much behind, or because of debt problems, or just because it's for them themselves, it's expensive and they're getting some grumbling at home. It doesn't feel like this is getting them a lot of joy and love. So why is it a concern to us? But that's not I want to ask a viewer question as well, which is a pretty simple one, which is COVID-19 and phase one. To what extent do you think phase one is really at risk now because of the disruption of COVID-19? And any other thoughts about how you think COVID-19 is changing the trade debate?
COVID on trade, I think, look, the trade numbers for purchases were always fantastical. COVID makes them somewhat more fantastical. On the other hand, the Chinese are purchasing, not at levels one might have expected under the agreement, but they're purchasing. And I think this sort of the up and down and day to day and are they, aren't they, are they, aren't they, is a little bit of a distraction. They'll buy what they can buy. They won't buy what they can't buy. And then the administration will make a decision whether that's good enough or not, or whether COVID is sort of the ultimate mitigating circumstance, and the Chinese just ought to have more time to do what they do. But under any of those scenarios, you're only strengthening state enterprises in China rather than working to discredit them. With respect to Belt and Road, I think Belt and Road has a lot of flaws, but conceptually, for China, it speaks to its ambition. And its ambition ultimately, if you can elevate off the specifics of Belt and Road and just sort of look down at 10,000 feet, its ambition is to be at the center of the Eurasian landmass. Belt and Road is a way to get there if it works right. Even if it's only half successful, it would be fabulously successful for China, as a way to ensure that China is at the center of consideration with respect to the countries with whom it trades or otherwise deals. And they're at the center of that consideration because Belt and Road is a series of individual bilateral deals with countries. It has a multilateral veneer. It is not remotely multilateral. It's bilateral, where China creates unique spaces for itself and whatever partner it is to create special rules or norms, to undertake certain obligations. All of this is opaque. All of this is non-transparent. And the only one that has information on everything is China. So for China, this kind of ambition to bring together within its orbit, if you will, within its sphere of influence, the countries of the Eurasian landmass. And of course, as you know, they've been trying to disintermediate the European Union for a long time, somewhat successfully so with respect to the southern European nations. But this ambition is, I think, a wake-up call to the West. Is this the direction in which you expect, for example, Europe to move? And if it isn't, well, you can't beat something with nothing. What is it then that you are selling? What are you communicating? What are those values or those enticements that ensure a world much more in balance, but not with China as a hegemonic power?
Terrific. Well, there's so much more that we would love to talk to you about, and we hope we can have you back. You're such a trooper. You come and do a lot of things with us at CSIS, and we really appreciate that. I wrote down here a word that you said earlier in this program. You said fantabulous. I can't even remember what you said was fantabulous, but whatever you just did was fantabulous, and it was really it was really great. And lots more questions from viewers, and I apologize to viewers who didn't get their question asked. It's these programs are not long enough, but we really appreciate it, Charlene. Thank you for your time, and do come back again. And
it's always my pleasure, as you know, Matt.
Thanks. And just to advertise, next week or 2 weeks from now, on June 29th, Monday the 29th, we're going to have the chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, Geeta Gopinath, is going to be on with us to talk about the economic impacts of COVID-19. So please do stay tuned for that. We'll send out an announcement soon, and that'll be an interesting program. At this point, we're going to wrap up with our usual little segment at the end called The Bottom Line. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye and thank everybody for your time and attention. Please stay tuned for The Bottom Line.
Between early February and early April, quicker than G20 countries responded during the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. Since then, emerging market economies have boosted spending, but are generally more finance constrained and therefore still lag advanced economy peers. Third, G20 loan guarantees now exceed $2.2 trillion. Loan guarantees incentivize banks to lend to keep business running at a time of heightened credit risk, but could eventually add to the fiscal burden on governments. Additional fiscal support is likely as global growth forecasts for 2020 are revised downward and countries face long-lasting employment impacts. You can explore this map and our other COVID-19 analysis at csis.org/economics.